excited to introduce friend and colleague John West, who's a senior fellow, managing director of the Center for Science and Culture, and also vice president at the Discovery Institute. John is formerly the chair of the Department of Political Science and Geography at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle, and then came on board full-time at Discovery some years ago. John is the award-winning author or editor of some 12 books, including Darwin Day in America, The Magician's Twin, and live action, the Disney Studios live action features of the 1950s and 1960s, which we're not going to get to hear about today. He's got a PhD from Claremont Graduate School, and he is going to talk to us. It's a really fascinating topic and really a kind of a correction of the record of the history of capitalism and the market economy, the survival of the fittest or survival of the statist, Darwin's real legacy for economics. So John, welcome, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to be here. I caught the latter part of your talk, which was a really great talk, Jay. Jay and George both are just so foundational in this whole area. And I know for myself, when I was a college undergraduate, reading George's book, Wealth and Poverty, was really a life changer for me because so much of the conceptions of capitalism that you hear about, even from conservatives, is that it's greed driven. And that's really not the case. So Jay referenced Gordon Gekko from the film Wall Street. I'm not sure how much he talked about him, but I'm going to begin with him too as a sort of a cultural icon. In the classic 1987 film Wall Street, Gordon Gekko is the consummate corporate raider, cunning and ruthless. And in one of the more memorable scenes of the film, he explains his economic philosophy to the stockholders meeting of a company he's trying to take over. It's an archetypal scene in American history, and it goes like this.
The new law of evolution in corporate America seems to be survival of the unfittest. Well, in my book, you either do it right or you get eliminated. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
Okay, greed is good. It epitomizes the evolutionary spirit, and that we're sort of violating that by survival of the unfittest. I think this scene epitomizes, in many ways, pop culture's view of capitalism. It's depicted as nothing more than social Darwinism, the application of economics of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. In Darwin's view of biology, all the most important features of living things were generated not by a rational and creative mind, but by a ruthless and accidental process of chance and necessity, a process Darwin called natural selection. Embedded in Darwin's concept of natural selection are two key ideas. First, progress in nature is ultimately the result of survival of the fittest, a process by which the sick, the maimed, the weak are mercilessly eliminated from biological populations, and only the fittest survive and reproduce. As Darwin put it, thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. We're going to tease that out a little bit more in a while, but really the second idea embedded in natural selection is that progress in nature is the result of a blind, non-teleological process. Natural selection is blind to the future, and thus in no sense are particular organisms or biological structures to be considered the purposeful result of evolution or the result of design. In the Darwinian view, biological structures such as the vertebrate eye, the wings of butterflies, or you and I, are developed through the interplay of chance, random mutations, and necessity, natural selection or survival of the fittest. To invoke the words of Harvard paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Now, apply this to economics. Well, this view, say social Darwinism applied to economics, represents an effort to define capitalism as driven primarily by Darwin's law of natural selection or survival of the fittest. According to a Darwinian view of economics, the best things in society were produced not primarily by the energy and creativity of entrepreneurs, but by the mass destruction of inferior products and companies. The Darwinian view of economics also stressed the supposedly blind and unguided nature of economic progress. I'd say this view of capitalism as nothing more than social Darwinism permeates our cultural debates about economic freedom. It forms part of the meta-narrative that helps people evaluate economic policy. In fact, anytime anyone advocates policies perceived to be favorable towards enterprise or entrepreneurship, they or their policies are invariably attacked as examples of social Darwinism. I actually have a whole collection of examples going back 3 or 4 decades on this. I'm only going to share a couple because we don't have time for more. But you can see during the age of Trump, here are some things that took place in the news media. Survival of the fittest, likely to be Trump administration's motto. Social Darwinism is what truly guides Trump. You can see GOP tax bill, social Darwinism makes a big comeback. You could even see that in the days of compassionate conservative George W. Bush, Obama accuses Bush of social Darwinism. And you go back to actually Andrew Cuomo, the recently disgraced governor of New York, has a famous talk that he gave in the 1980s against Ronald Reagan, where he accused Ronald Reagan of social Darwinism. So this is really the term of choice to attack people who believe in free market economics. Now, the interesting thing is this claim that capitalism is nothing more than social Darwinism is one of the most long-standing attacks on free market capitalism in our own culture, going back about 100, 150 years. Yet it also constitutes one of the biggest myths in the history of business and economics. The genesis of this myth can be traced largely to a single book, and that is this book. It was Social Darwinism in American Thought, published by progressive historian Richard Hofstadter from Columbia University. Originally published in 1944, Hofstadter's book was quickly elevated to the status of classic, and it's actually been used to instruct entire generations of graduate students and teachers in the field of history and elsewhere. Ever since it came out, its message has been continuously recycled in social science textbooks, right down to the present day. And what was Hofstadter's message? Well, primarily, he said in the late 19th century, America was dominated by the ruthless captains of industry who explicitly justified their cutthroat business policies by appeals to Darwin's theory of natural selection. In other words, capitalism was explicitly advocated as an expression of social Darwinism. There's just one problem. Hofstadter's picture of the 19th century capitalist turns out to be more fiction than fact. 19th century American businessmen and economists did praise free enterprise and competition, but they didn't justify these ideas by appealing to Darwin or Darwinian worldview. As historian Irving Wiley explained just within a few years of that book being published by Hofstadter, he said this, again, this is historian Irving Wiley. Businessmen of the era who talked about success and failure took their texts from Christian moralists, not from Darwin and Spencer. In the race for wealth, they attributed little influence to native intelligence, physical strength, or any other endowment of nature, and paramount influence to industry, frugality, and sobriety, simple moral virtues that any man could cultivate. And since they thought business success was supposed to be based on good character, one businessman's success did not have to be built on top of another businessman's failure. Instead, as Wiley points out, the people of the era, the businessmen of the era, argued that opportunities for success were regarded as limitless. At its core, this American resistance of American capitalists to invoking Darwinism as a rationale for capitalism reflected their rejection of the pessimism the fundamental pessimism at the heart of Darwin's theory, which had been inspired, after all, according to Darwin, by his reading of the Reverend Thomas Malthus's dour essay on the principle of population. For those of you who don't know about the Reverend Malthus, he argued that men, animals, and plants all tend to reproduce more offspring than nature can support. The inevitable result of this overpopulation is widespread death until the population is reduced to a level that nature can support. Darwin basically adopted this struggle for existence idea articulated by Malthus as the foundation for his theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, apply this, though, to the world of commerce. If you apply this view to the world of commerce, Malthusian theory presents economics as a zero-sum game. In the Darwinian Malthusian view, additional people almost inevitably mean greater privation for many human beings. The more people there are, the less food there will be to go around. The more laborers there are, the lower the standard wage will be. According to this view, the static view, economic progress for the few can only be purchased at the price of misery for the many. Far from embracing Malthus, American defenders of capitalism during the latter 1800s explicitly repudiated the Malthusian view of economics, which meant that they also had little desire to invoke Darwinism as a defense of free enterprise because it was so tied to Malthus. I'm just going to have time for one example here, and that's American businessman and economist Edward Atkinson, who's a good example of the actual view of American defenders of capitalism in the late 19th century. Atkinson denounced any attempt to wed economics to Malthus's theory because, according to Atkinson, capitalism allowed mankind to alleviate the struggle for existence by creating greater abundance for everyone. Instead of being a destructive struggle for static resources, commerce in a free society, according to Atkinson, could generate sufficient new resources to raise the standard of living for ever greater numbers of people. Atkinson argued that capitalism's abundance was brought about chiefly by harnessing the mental faculties of man through new technologies. He argued that Malthus's view failed when applied to human beings because invention, and I'm quoting him, invention and discovery have yielded greater and greater abundance for each given portion of time devoted to the work of procuring subsistence. So far from promoting the destruction of the many on behalf of the success of a few, commerce could lead to progress for all. And this increased wealth was generated not by ruthless and amoral competition, but by mutual service, which in Atkinson's view lay at the heart of economics. Now I'm quoting from him again. Commerce is an occupation in which men serve each other. It's an exchange in which both parties in the transaction gain something which they desire more than the thing that they part with. Atkinson's optimistic defense of free enterprise was the standard view adopted by businessmen during the 19th century. So if few businessmen or economists during the Gilded Age invoked Darwinism to justify capitalism, how did this idea of the social Darwinist defender of business arise? Well, for the most part, it was not capitalism's defenders, it was capitalism's critics and detractors who identified capitalism with Darwin's theory. In the late 19th and early 20th century, various progressive reformers tried to discredit capitalism by claiming that it was nothing but social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, applied to the world of business. So social Darwinism from the start was actually developed by capitalism's critics to attack capitalism, not as a justification for capitalism. Now, ironically, after critics had effectively tarred capitalism with the social Darwinist label, some businessmen and economists did begin to appropriate the Darwinist metaphor as a defense of free enterprise. Some of these later defenders of capitalism tried to link Darwinian theory to free enterprise by emphasizing the ability of economic systems to generate what they called spontaneous order without an overarching designer. Here it was Darwin's emphasis on the unguided nature of evolution that was regarded as the most relevant application for economics. So accordingly, Friedrich Hayek championed, Friedrich Hayek, if I go back, I'm going in the wrong direction. Friedrich Hayek championed what he called the emergence of order as the result of adaptive evolution. This was the idea that, and I'm quoting from Hayek, complex and orderly and a very definite sense, purposive structures might grow up which owed little or nothing to design, which were not invented by a contriving mind, but arose from the separate actions of many men who did not know what they were doing. Now, modern political theorist Larry Arnhart has gone one step further and revised Hayek's idea of spontaneous order as a key plank in the platform of what he calls Darwinian conservatism. However, this effort to extrapolate from Darwin's mechanism in nature to the spontaneous order found in human society is based on a fundamentally false analogy. The causes of spontaneous order, so-called spontaneous order among human beings, are simply not equivalent to the mindless process of chance and necessity postulated by Darwinian biology. The Darwinian process in nature is supposed to be built on blind intelligence and to the future. Random, in other words, purposeless and non-guided variations are in the driver's seat. Variations in the social world, however, are driven by human beings exercising their intelligence and foresight. This intelligence and foresight may well be limited. Hayek is right on that. But it is neither purposeless nor completely blind to the future. It's therefore highly misleading and really not helpful, actually, to say that human order arises spontaneously in the way that say, Darwinian theory advocates in biology. That term seems to suggest, especially when people like Arnhart tie it to Darwin, seems to suggest a lack of any conscious thought. Yet human social order arises out of the intentional actions of individuals and groups to associate with each other, to exchange goods, to improve their environment, to cooperate. Just because these actions are decentralized does not mean they are not designed. This sort of design-driven cooperation is alien to the Darwinian mechanism. It's not alien, however, to the teachings of the classical school of economics that predated Darwin. So I think, in the end, neither natural selection nor Darwinism's insistence on an undirected process offers any real support for economic liberty. The case for capitalism is not analogous to natural selection in biology, and innovations in goods and services are not created through an unguided process operating without the action of intelligent agents. Indeed, rather than function as a support for economic liberty, Darwinism has been effectively employed by the critics of capitalism to demonize free enterprise as nothing more than survival of the fittest applied to economics. However, Darwinism's impact in the era of economics has not been merely the delegitimization of capitalism. It also has provided a powerful justification for the expansion of state power over the economy. In short, while social Darwinism wasn't particularly key to the development of capitalism, it did make several powerful contributions to socialism, so much so that one historian has coined the term socialist Darwinism. So what were these contributions of Darwinism to the socialist worldview? Well, you see, the first one is that Darwin's materialistic version of evolution was praised by socialists for banning teleology or purpose from nature. According to Karl Marx, he actually said, despite all, to a correspondent that he wrote to, despite all its shortcomings, it's here in Darwin's work that for the first time, teleology in natural science is not only dealt a mortal blow, but its rational meaning is empirically explained. So according to Marx, Darwin helped deal the death blow to teleology or purpose in nature, that nature is the product of some sort of purposeful process. Second, those on the left thought that Darwin's theory of natural selection provided a biological foundation for the class struggle in human society. In fact, Karl Marx wrote to one of his correspondents, quote, Darwin's work provides a basis in natural science for the historical. Marx wrote that in 1861, so just a couple of years after On the Origin of Species was published. For socialists, Darwin's survival of the fittest provided not a solution for society, but a diagnosis of the problem. Darwin's law of the jungle produced us, but it was also cruel. So the goal of socialists was not to perpetuate the Darwinian struggle for survival in their view, but to overcome it by building their workers' utopia. In the famed words of Marx, his goal was not to merely interpret the world, but to change it. So in the socialist version of survival of the fittest, it was the members of the proletariat who would prove themselves fittest by joining together to topple their capitalist overlords. Okay, finally, a third contribution Darwinism made to the socialist worldview was its support for the necessity, indeed the inevitability of change. This idea was especially influential among members of what became known as the progressive movement in the United States. According to progressives, nations and their economic systems are subject to evolution just as much as plants and animals. And like plants and animals, nations must adapt to new conditions or die. So governments must evolve too. While laissez-faire may have been required by the conditions of a previous era, new social conditions called for new economic policies, according to the progressives. Now, in adopting their evolutionary view of government, the progressive reformers had to discard the political theory of, say, the American founders, who, just as much as they did the teachings of capitalism. America's founders had claimed that government existed to secure certain unchanging natural rights. Because these rights did not change, neither did the purposes of government. The founders' conception of government was thus more stationary than evolutionary, but such a conception was tantamount to heresy in the new scientific view of the world. One of the most articulate spokesmen for the new view was a political scientist from New Jersey named Woodrow Wilson, who eventually, it's going ahead of me, Woodrow Wilson, who eventually, of course, became president of the United States. Wilson explicitly claimed that living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. According to Wilson, again, quoting from him, all that progressives ask or desire is permission to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. The doctrine of the evolving Constitution articulated by Wilson and other progressives opened the door to much greater regulation of business and the economy, paving the way for, I'd say, the situation we face today. Now, a final contribution of Darwinism to socialist or progressive worldviews was providing a biological basis for what might be called the scientific state. Those on the left were smitten by the authority of science and increasingly argued that government must be run not by democratically elected representatives or left to ordinary people to run their own lives, but by appointed scientific and technical experts. They argued that we must be governed by scientific expertise, not the wisdom of voters or ordinary people. And this became the case, really the basis of the case for government planning in all areas of life, including the economy, I'd say including in public health policy, which we've actually seen over the last year with shutdowns and everything else. Really, Darwinism helped feed into this, what C.S. Lewis called scientocracy, or you could also call it technocracy. Perhaps the most horrifying example of implementing this idea of scientocracy or technocracy was what became known as eugenics, which was the coercive effort to breed a better human race through forced sterilization and other techniques. Eugenics was actually explicitly inspired by Darwinian biology. Indeed, it was pushed by the leading evolutionary biologists from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, and other elite institutions. Eugenics was based on a Darwinian view of human development. Following Darwin, socialists believed that humans rose to the top of the food chain not because we were designed on purpose by some beneficent creator to be unique and rational beings, but merely because we are the accidental products of a Darwinian struggle for survival. At the same time, however, these socialists and progressives wanted to get rid of the Darwinian struggle for survival. That was their goal of creating their classless society. But this created a huge conundrum for them. If the only reason humans have their current capabilities is because of the struggle for survival, continually honing their skills, what happens to humans once the struggle for survival is removed? Progressives who accepted Darwin, at least the sophisticated ones, recognized that their policies gave rise to a serious problem. Once socialism created the new classless society and removed the struggle for existence, it would also remove the only thing that kept humans fit. The old Darwinian law of evolution. In short, they needed to find a way to recreate something like natural selection through science, rationally and humanely. And that became the rationale for the eugenics crusade. Basically, eugenics was the science of breeding better people by harnessing the principle of Darwinian selection. It led to the compulsory sterilization of more than 60,000 Americans, restrictive immigration policies in America, and a host of other inhumane policies around the world, including many of the policies of killing the handicapped in Germany, all done in the name of science and in Darwinian biology in particular. I think there's a really severe irony here. Although in pop culture, capitalism is viewed as a social expression of Darwinism, in reality, it was far more socialism and progressivism that owed a lot to the Darwinian worldview. So, as I begin to wrap up, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Well, I think for a century or more, academics and journalists and commentators and filmmakers have successfully demonized capitalism and entrepreneurship as little more than social Darwinism. They've also upheld the scientifically planned and regulated state as the antidote to the evils of social Darwinist capitalism, which is one reason we've experienced such scientocracy in the last year. As a result, the default position of policymakers is increasingly to regulate and punish anyone who shows initiative, anyone who thinks outside the box. Because the background assumption is that business people and entrepreneurs are simply social Darwinists. And because of this, the default public policy position is that entrepreneurs, above all else, must be prevented from preying upon the rest of society. But the result of this mindset that stigmatizes entrepreneurs, I'd say, are actually the opposite of what's intended. Because it's not really the big corporations, who I actually do think can pose a danger to society, but it's not really the big corporations who are punished by this punitive mindset. They have the Amazons of the world, the Microsofts of the world, the Apples of the world, have more than enough money to buy enough lawyers and pay off enough politicians to protect themselves. Those most harmed by this mindset that equates enterprise with social Darwinism are the relatively weak and powerless immigrants, people of color, first-generation entrepreneurs, and small businessmen. These victims of socialist Darwinism are people like, and I'm just going to have time to give one example here. Need to go back. Talib Din Uqda and his wife. The Uqdas launched a small company in Washington, D.C. to provide high-quality African hair braiding for their customers. They then faced more than a decade of harassment from the local board of cosmetology that tried to shut them down, despite the fact that hair braiding wasn't even explicitly under the authority of the cosmetology board. The board wanted to force this couple to spend thousands of dollars to train their employees in techniques that they did not even provide, including the use of a variety of chemicals, even though their hair braiding techniques were chemical-free. Now, this is one story, but I think it represents a systemic problem, a pervasive culture that's unsympathetic to the value of entrepreneurs. Now, don't get me wrong, greed is real, and there are corrupt business people and corporations, just like there are corrupt bureaucrats, corrupt policemen, and corrupt charities. But the notion that the core of entrepreneurship is social Darwinism is simply propaganda. Real entrepreneurship requires, I'd say, self-sacrifice, delayed gratification, innovation, and really a desire to do something better than before. It requires treating other people, your customers, as more important than yourself. Business people who act like social Darwinists are in fact very poor entrepreneurs. So we need to find ways, I think, to change a culture that demonizes entrepreneurship as social Darwinism and that elevates social Darwinism as the preferred solution to our problems. I think that recognizing a problem is the first step to finding a solution. So I hope that I've at least raised your awareness of one of the sort of cultural roots of this, I'd say, cultural misunderstanding and mischaracterization of business and entrepreneurship. And with that, I'm going to end, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, John. That was terrific. So a remind to everyone, we want the questions to go in the Q&A.
So I see one right away.
Go for it. Yeah, John, go ahead.
I've heard recently the basic thought that survival of the fittest is not scientifically valid anymore. This is from an atheist, thankfully not a hostile one. Is this a valid thought? Well, so I think everyone accepts that the idea of natural selection is real. It does do things. The thing is, it doesn't do what Darwin thought it did. So it's not just that, it winnows out bad things because that, in fact, it does, but it doesn't have the creative power to create fundamentally new things. And I'd say in this way, they are finding that out in biology. And so that's why in 2016, in fact, you had one of the world's leading scientific organizations, the Royal Society in England, convene a conference of top biologists from around the world and top scientists trying to come up with a new theory of evolution that wasn't just based on the creative power of natural selection. Because I think you're right, growing in the mainstream scientific community, at least those who really follow the evidence, is that natural selection will do some things. It won't get you those fundamentally new things. And I'd say this is precisely what you'd expect from economics, because in economics, competition and the winnowing out of things is important. And I don't want to knock that, and I want to make that clear. But when you're talking about, that only gets you so far. Where does the innovations come from in economics? The fundamentally new products, the new services, the things that the technological leaps. And I think as George and Jay are really good at explicating this far more than I am, is that when you're looking for the great advances in the economy, it's not just because of competition. Competition is a helpful pressure, but it's not the fundamental thing that's causing the new innovations. So let's see. What was the name of the author who responded to Hofstadter? Well, one of the one I cited was Irvin. It's actually Irvin Wiley. W-Y. I think it's Llie. I'd encourage, if you want more information on this, get my book. Plug for my book, Darwin Day in America, and look in the chapters on economics, where I go in a lot more depth than I can go here. The interesting thing about Hofstadter's book is it had a lot of factual errors even. It misportrayed some capitalists and misquoted them. And this was pointed out within a year or two of when the book came out. His book went out under multiple editions in the next several decades, and he never fixed any of the errors. Okay, so let's see. Is the real danger not statism and not capitalism, state protecting their supportive capital interests? Well, I think I'd say all of the above. I mean, the state protects their supportive capital interests because the state wants to protect its power. I mean, if you are I'm I guess going into more dangerous territory here, but if you're in, say, certain public health authorities, you don't want your power to go away. And so you want your power for lockdowns and everything else without anyone else being able to challenge you. So I think it's a sort of toxic collaboration. And so, yeah, part of it is the state is protecting sort of corporate capitalists, and vice versa, but it's people who have power, they don't want to give it up. I mean, that's a very human thing.
John, I'm wondering if he's talking about the kind of cronyism, because it's the 20th century was sort of free economy versus state socialism and command economies, whereas now we have this weird hybrid where you have these large corporate actors and they're this kind of connected to the regulatory state. And this is, it's different than the kind of state socialism of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Okay. Someone asked, how ideological was Darwin? To the best of your knowledge, would he have been open to all the new discoveries that he obviously did not know about? Well, I think a lot of Darwin, because I think he mastered a sort of encyclopedic knowledge. If you read his Origin of Species or his other books, for his time period, I mean, he just synthesized all sorts of information. Having said that, there were a lot of scientists during the Darwin's lifetime who presented some fundamental issues with the creative power of natural selection and how much the evidence showed or not showed. And he wasn't very open to that evidence. In fact, he got upset. So one of the best examples is Alfred Russel Wallace, who is co-credited as discovering natural selection, evolution by natural selection, along with Darwin. If you read all the biology textbooks, you'll see him mentioned and then forgotten. One reason he's forgotten is that Wallace fundamentally disagreed with Darwin about just how much natural selection could actually accomplish. And when Darwin saw him saying that, Darwin was just quite upset. I mean, he sort of, so I don't know. I would like to think that Darwin would be, Darwin was certainly more civil than some of his current champions, like the Richard Dawkins of the world. On the other hand, he didn't seem all that open to the criticisms, the fact-based empirical criticisms that were offered at the time. So I think that's all the questions that I see. So,
Well, that's perfect.
anyway.
All right. Thanks so much, John.